For the past few months, we have been watching the remarkable rise of David, right? From his obscurity out in the fields, tending his father's sheep, to his secret anointing by Samuel on that day that he went to Bethlehem, to when we saw him become Israel's champion and commander of Saul's army, and we have the people singing his praises out in the street, right? But now we've come to some very dark chapters in the story of David's life. For now, David is a fugitive. He is on the run. He's escaping the murderous rage of Saul, the rejected king, who just wants him dead. And all of those songs of victory that were being sung, well, those things have now kind of faded off into the background, into the distance. Because David is no longer the hero who's dining at Saul's table. He's no longer the man who's enjoying the king's favor. He is a hunted man, running for his life. There's some parallels to our life. Maybe ours isn't as serious as David's, right? We're not being hunted by a murderous, rage-filled king. But we've experienced in our own life, maybe at a time, a sudden collapse in our own circumstances. Where one day everything was going good. Our job was stable. We felt secure. Enough money in the bank. Our health is fine. Our relationships are strong. And then one phone call. One betrayal. Just upends everything. Everything shifts. Everything changes like the rug being pulled out from under us. That's exactly where we find David here in chapter 21 of 1 Samuel. He's alone. He's afraid. He's tired. He's hungry. He's hunted. Yet in that dark valley that he found himself in, God teaches him something. God teaches him a lesson, and he teaches us a lesson as well. A profound truth that when fear drives you down into the valley of desperation, God's covenant mercy drives you up to your ultimate refuge, which is Jesus Christ, our great priest and king. That even in our weakest, we are held by a grace that we have not earned, and frankly, we do not deserve. That's what we're going to read in today's story. So we're going to look at it in two parts. Grace provides for the weak, and grace preserves the fearful. First, we're going to look at the first 9 verses of 1 Samuel chapter 21. Let's read the word of the Lord. Hear the words of the living God. Then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech came to meet David trembling, and said to him, "Why are you alone, and no one with you?" And David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has charged me with a matter and said to me, 'Let no one know anything of the matter about which I send you, and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever is here.' And the priest answered David, 'I have no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have kept themselves from women.' And David answered the priest, 'Truly women have been kept from us, as always when I go on in expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy?' So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord to be replaced by hot bread on the day it is taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. Then David said to Ahimelech, 'Then have you not here a spear or a sword at hand? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste.' And the priest said, 'The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you struck down in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is none but that here.' And David said, 'There is none like that. Give it to me.'" This is the word of the Lord. Just remembering where we are at in this story, right? Jonathan, out of covenant love and covenant loyalty, works out the plan that David had concocted to discover if Saul indeed meant to kill him, right? Meant him harm. And yeah, that whole plan just kind of came out in the open. And Jonathan and David have that just touching moment. They weep, they kiss one another, right? They renew their covenant love and loyalty to one another, and David is on the run, right? We already saw him on the run, but he was going back in the hopes that maybe it wasn't as bad as he thought it was. Maybe Saul had just kind of set aside the anger and jealousy he had, and there was a place still for David there at court, but that's just been blown apart there, right? So he is on the run. And he's fleeing, and here he flees to the city of Nob. Now, Nob was just a short distance from the king's palace at Gibeah, right? So it's not like he went far away, but notice where it is that he's running to, right? We're told that here was a priest, the priest of the Lord, right? So Nob seems to be the place where the tabernacle was resettled. If you recall back in the early parts of 1 Samuel, where was the tabernacle? It was at Shiloh. It's where the priest of the Lord was. That's where the sacrifice were being offered. Well, it seems like the Philistines had succeeded in destroying Shiloh, and now this is where the tabernacle was. In the next chapter, we'll see that Nob is called the city of the priests. So there was a lot of priests there at Nob. And he comes to a specific priest. This happens to be the high priest by the name of Ahimelech, right? And Ahimelech is the great-grandson of good old Eli. Remember Eli? Back from so many months ago, right? So that's who we have here in the story. But notice how he greets David. He's not overjoyed in seeing David. It says that he greets him trembling. He's afraid. Like, why would he be afraid of seeing David? Well, he's afraid for good reason. Because David shouldn't be alone. He asks him, why are you alone? Who's David? Well, David is the commander of Saul's army. David is the king's son-in-law. David is the guy that everybody is singing the praises of. Why on earth would he show up here without his military escort, without his servants, without his entourage? Like, he begins to suspect something is off here. Something's just not right with David appearing alone. Imagine if you saw the president's son out in the street by himself, without his Secret Service detail. You'd think that a little odd. Like, that's kind of weird. So this is kind of weird for him in this moment. Maybe not to us, but it's possible that he knew that David was a fugitive. And him showing up here just kind of set off all sorts of alarms, right? Now look how David responds to him. He responds with a lie. He doesn't tell Ahimelech the truth. Well, I'm on the run. You know Saul, he's a little crazy. He wants to kill me. No, he lies to the priest. He tells him, well, the king has sent me on a really top secret mission. It's highly sensitive. If I tell you, I have to kill you, right? But that's why I'm here. And oh, by the way, there's some young men that are going to meet me at such and such a place at a certain time. So that's why I'm here. He's lying to the priest, fabricating a cover story. This is not one of David's finest moments. But I think it speaks to his emotional state. David's not in a good place. And maybe that's understandable to us and probably should be. But why would he lie? Why would he lie? Well, we're not told why he lied. I think we can make assumptions, right? I think we can just kind of guess at the reasons here. All we're getting from the narrator here is just a report of what David did, certainly not a recommendation of what to do if you're in a similar situation. But it's interesting as I studied this chapter how commentators have just all different positions as to why David may have lied under these circumstances. Some would argue that what he was doing here was trying to protect Ahimelech. That if he let him in on what truly was going on, he'd be implicating him, right? And he'd be almost aiding and abetting a fugitive of the crown, right? So he doesn't tell him the true story here in order to protect the priest. What he doesn't know, maybe can't hurt him. Others have argued that, well, David, in essence, would be justified to use deception here in this moment. We've already seen David lie. You know, there was a lie that he had Jonathan get in on to try to suss out what Saul's intentions were on, right? Back, his wife, Michal, even employed deception, right? So that David could get away, right? We're seeing just kind of immoral things. Let's just call them what they are, taking place in the story here. But some have said, well, he would be justified. This is kind of like a tactical deception, right? As some would employ in a time of war. Still others have argued that really it was just fear and a lack of faith that was driving David to lie in this moment. Now, I probably lean more to that kind of argument there. It's what's happening here. The truth is, we don't know. We really don't know why he would lie in this case. But whatever the case, we do know that fear can make us respond in ways we wouldn't respond and do things we wouldn't normally do if we weren't in the grip of fear. If we weren't afraid. We've seen throughout 1 Samuel that David was a real man with real flaws. We need to resist the urge to paint him as some superhero saint. He's just a real dude. That's all he was. He's a God-fearing man, but he was a young man under enormous stress. And he was genuinely afraid of Saul's threats. He really believed that Saul had every intention of killing him. And if we knew that ourselves, could you imagine the stress we would be under? The emotional strain we would find ourselves in. He was in a tense life or death situation. Having, I believe, a genuine crisis of faith in that moment. The man who stood before Goliath and declared, the battle is the Lord's, is now standing in front of a priest and telling lies to save his own skin. That's who David was. And that's what fear does to us. When we're afraid, we could default to scheming, to coloring the truth a bit, trying to manage the situation instead of trusting God. I can certainly think of quite a few times in my own life where I gave into the temptation to fear, and my trust in God waned in those moments. And I thought, this is on me now. I better figure this thing out. That's a failure. And I believe David kind of is experiencing that in this moment. But what happens next shows us the grace of God. Specifically, the grace of God and his provision in the midst of David's weakness. What does David ask for of the priest? He says, give me 5 loaves of bread, right? Whatever you've got on hand. Now, that's kind of interesting because I don't consider the tabernacle to have been the local grocery store, right? The local bakery, right? To go find loaves of bread, right? If you're hungry here. So it seems out of place. Now, Ahimelech responds that he doesn't have any common bread, but only the holy bread. Only the holy bread. Now, what he's referring to here, the bread of presence, sometimes it's referred to as the showbread, was something that God instructed the priest to bake for the Sabbath day. Okay, and you find this in Leviticus 24. There's references to it also in Exodus. But they're to bake 12 loaves of bread that were to be placed on a golden table in the holy place. Okay, and they were set up in 2 rows of 6. And these 12 loaves represented the 12 tribes of Israel. The whole of God's people. And the fact that it was placed in the holy place before the Holy of Holies was a representation of the whole people of God that were before the face of God continually. And the bread was a symbol of God's provision, his sustenance of his people, his provision for his people in supplying their needs. So it's a beautiful, it depicted something really beautiful. And every Sabbath, fresh loaves would be placed out on the table, and those 6-day-old or 7-day-old breads would have been removed. And those pieces of bread would have been under the domain of the priest, who now had the right to eat that consecrated bread, right? So it was holy bread. It was sacred bread because it had been devoted to the Lord. And by rights, it belonged to the priest. And they could then eat that the bread that was replaced by the fresh bread. And now we have David coming, asking for bread. Now, it was probably the Sabbath day or the day after, and maybe he knew that bread of the presence would have been available, right? But is David a priest? Is he a Levite? No, under the law, that belonged to the priests here. But notice that Ahimelech does something really interesting here. He inquired if David's men were consecrated. Like, why would he do that? They're not priests either. But, are they consecrated? Have they just kind of cleansed themselves so they could actually partake of holy things and eat the holy bread? And now David's telling a tale here again, right? He's lying again. Oh, yeah, they're good to go. They've kept themselves, from women. They're all good. And, man, even in ordinary times, they're good to go. How much more now? Like, he's really stretching this thing. He could have just said they are. But Ahimelech's doing something interesting here in showing David compassion. That Ahimelech understood that the bread was always meant to keep God's people alive. That there's something even greater than strict adherence to these ceremonial laws. And he takes that holy bread that by all rights belonged only to the priest, and he puts it into the hands of David. Like using his authority as a priest to exercise discernment, a judgment in that moment, and determined that it was better for David to have sustenance, to not starve, than to follow the law as he always had. But why is this important? I find this story so important because it's a story that Jesus himself tells. You remember this? In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus is with his disciples and they're going through a grain field, and his disciples are hungry. And so they grab some of the grain, they rub it in their hands, and they're eating it as they're walking through the grain fields. And what happens? Those good old Pharisees show up. And they begin to criticize Jesus' disciples, right? They criticize them for breaking Sabbath traditions. And Jesus says this to them. Well, they say your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath, all right? It's on the Sabbath. They're working on the Sabbath. But they're considering what the disciples are doing this moment as work. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. But that's not technically correct. They actually even misunderstand the law here. Because what the disciples were doing in that moment was actually in keeping with the law. Because in Deuteronomy chapter 23, God had made provisions for a hungry traveler to get something to eat if he was hungry. If he was passing by his neighbor's grain field, he could actually pluck with his hands some of those grains and eat them for sustenance. So long as he didn't actually use agricultural tools to take of that grain like a sickle, right? As long as he took it with his hands, he could actually pluck some of the standing grain to satisfy an immediate need. And here the legalistic Pharisees are saying, nope, they violated the Sabbath prohibitions against work. And here's how Jesus responds. He responds by reaching back to this story we're looking at in 1 Samuel 21. He says to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? How he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was, listen to what he says here, which it was not lawful for him to eat, but only for the priests. He's like, wait a minute, guys. Don't you remember what David, whom you highly esteem, who you highly respect, who you look up to, don't you remember what he did, how he went in there and he ate the bread of the presence and it wasn't lawful for him to do it? He actually violated the law by eating what only the priests was reserved for the priests. And here are these Pharisees just nitpicking an act that actually was lawful. Because what his disciples were doing was not wrong. What Jesus is saying to them is, you're being inconsistent. You're calling something unlawful, which is actually lawful, and you're not even considering an act that was unlawful, and you think it was okay. But he doesn't stop there. Jesus mentions to them how the priests are actually doing work on the Sabbath. Have you ever stopped to think about, here the law says do nothing on the Sabbath, yet what did the priests have to do on the Sabbath? A whole lot of work. A whole lot of work. Not just baking those 12 loaves, right, on that day. There was actually sacrifices being done, preparation. Like, the priests are working, which would be considered unlawful on the Sabbath, yet Jesus says they're guiltless. So there's an inconsistency in these Pharisees here. But he continues, I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. That's a big deal, right? And if you understood what Hosea wrote, and he quotes Hosea here, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned my disciples who have not broken the law. You guys are wrong on every level. You're inconsistent. You're misapplying the law. You're calling what my disciples did as unlawful, and it's not. And you're missing the point of it all. What Jesus was doing was pointing out the heart of God's law. The ceremonial law was designed to serve people, not to starve people for the sake of ritual precision. And here for the Pharisees, for their strict adherence to the law, to just kind of beat their chest, look how self-righteous we are. Ahimelech understood that preserving the life of God's servant took precedence over strict adherence to the ceremonial law. That's amazing. Mercy and these acts of mercy trumped ceremonial adherence. Jesus tells the Pharisees, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He's declaring himself to be the greater David, the true and greater high priest. He trumps the Sabbath traditions because he is Lord of the Sabbath. And guess what his heart's all about? His heart's about mercy. He feeds his people when they are hungry. You remember what he said in John chapter 6? He declared that he is the bread of life. Whoever comes to him shall not hunger. Jesus feeds his people, and the bread that he offers is himself. What was the bread of presence ultimately all about? What was it pointing to? That bread on the table in the holy place? It was always pointing to him the whole time. Every Sabbath, fresh loaves, nourishment, sustenance, God's provisions for his people, over and over and over and over again. It was all pointing to Jesus, the bread of life. So when we're spiritually exhausted, when we've been carrying a heavy load for a long time, and it feels like our tank is just on empty, we have a high priest that we can approach, that we can come to, who meets us in our weakness and feeds us with his grace. And I love that he's not there holding just a checklist of our failings, and just ticking off of all of our failures and our mistakes and our sins and looking for a reason to just turn us away. No, but he's holding out bread to us. Bread to hungry sinners to feast on him for life. That's the gospel. That's the gospel. Now, we could sit here and judge David all we want. We could say that David didn't deserve that bread. Wasn't his. He lied to the priest. Like something seriously off with David, isn't it? He deceived the priest of the Lord. Yet God fed him anyway. What is that? That's grace. That's the grace of God. And the grace of God is not a reward for those who finally get their act together, who clean themselves up before they approach God. No, grace is God's provision for people who are at the end of themselves. That's exactly where David was in this moment. In his desperation, in his fear, right? All of those things, God provided. God fed him. We receive our daily bread not because we're godly, but because our Lord is gracious. Our God is a gracious God. Let's move on there. Verse 7, we just kind of have this verse that just kind of like sticks out in a real ominous way to us. Because it mentions this kind of shadowy figure that's there that day, lurking in the background of the story here. A man by the name of Doeg. Doeg, the Edomite. All we know about him at this moment is that he's Saul's man. Chief of herdsmen of Saul. And what's he doing there? Well, he's detained by the Lord. He's on some business there, temple business. We don't know exactly. But he's watching. He sees David. And that's going to become a big deal in the next chapter here, right? He sees David, and he's going to report everything he sees, right? He sees the bread change hands. He sees what happens next in the story, the Goliath's sword in David's possession now, right? He's seeing all this, and he's going to tell Saul everything that he saw at Nob. And we're going to see the deadly repercussions of David's presence there at Nob this day, and Doeg's wicked actions. And poor Ahimelech, right, this kind man showing mercy to David, it's going to cost him his life and the life of many other people. And this is here, I think, inserted in the story of the narrator to remind us that David's actions and all the decisions that he made impacted other people. Just same for us, right? There were real consequences that David couldn't even see coming when he came to Nob and chose to lie and chose to ask for the things that he did that day. When he told his lie, he was not only putting himself at risk, but also others, right? And again, our sin impacts others, doesn't it? We like to think that our private sins and our private decisions and our private choices really only affect us. No, they always get out. It always gets out into the open. They don't really stay private. Our fear, our half-truths, the little white lies that we tell, that we go, yeah, there's nothing really wrong with that. They affect people around us. There are ripple effects that touch our families, touch all of our relationships, even impact our church, right? None of that stays private. And I think that this is kind of tucked into the story just for us to give us pause for a moment to think about that. So David not only asked for bread, notice what he asked for next. For a weapon. Hey, thanks for the bread. You got an AK, an AR, you got some handguns. What do you got here, right? Knife, spear, a sword. Again, I don't recall reading in the Mosaic Law provision for an armory in the tabernacle, but he's asking for a weapon. And I think David probably knew there was something there, but he's asking for something there. And notice, he tells Ahimelech another lie. Couldn't just be truthful. He just kind of, oh, by the way, because I had to leave really fast, right, because the king's business, right, meant, a hasty departure here, I couldn't bring my own weapons with me, right? I had to leave them behind because I had to get on my horse and ride, right? And so here I am. What have you got, right? And again, Ahimelech says, well, just so happens that there is a sword here. It's the sword of Goliath, the man that you struck down in the valley of Elah. And if you'll have it, it's yours. That's all there is here. There's none but that here. And David says, I'll take it. There's none like that. I love that play on words, even in our English translation. There's none but that here. And David's like, there's none like that, right? And so, yeah, give me that sword. Again, it's possible he knew that was the resting place of that sword. It's interesting that after that, the account of when he cut Goliath's head off with his own sword there, that David actually kept Saul's armor in his tent. And that sword came back to him, in the future, it ends up in David's house, okay? But here, it's in the tabernacle. Somehow it came to be stored there with the priest. We don't know how, but there it was. But think about God's providence here. In this particular moment, of all the swords in all the world, the one that just happened to be there was the giant's sword. And that sword was the trophy from the greatest day of David's life. The day that God gave him victory, right, in the most impossible of situations. And now, on the worst day of David's life, the only weapon in the whole place is the reminder of the greatest day of David's life. That's not coincidence. That's the providence of the Lord. And God has a way, brothers and sisters, of reminding us of His faithfulness the very moment we are in most need of that reminder. That He is faithful to us. I imagine David took hold of that sword, and as he held it in his hand, that massive sword, right? Because this was a 9-foot-tall dude. And he remembered how he'd gone out with a sling and with 5 smooth stones and with the name of the Lord. And that was enough. And he declared that the Lord does not save with sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's. I believe that sword in his hand became an Ebenezer. Remember that? Remember that from chapter 7? When Samuel set up those stones, right? He called it Ebenezer, a stone of help, and he said, till here the Lord, till now the Lord has helped us. I believe that sword in his hand was just a reminder of the Lord's help. Back when he stood before this giant, with impossible odds, with inferior weapons. And the Lord wrought a great victory that day and saved His people. He was reminded that the God who was faithful to him down in the valley of Elah is now faithful here in the valley of the shadow of death, there at Nob. What a visual. What a visual. Every time he looked at that oversized sword in his hand, he was reminded, God delivered you before, David. He delivered you before. He can deliver you again. You and I need those kind of reminders also. We need to be reminded. We need our own Ebenezers. I've encouraged you in this before. Write that promise out, that verse on a card, and stick it on your fridge and put it in that mirror every morning, and that you stare at that and you remind yourself of the promises of God, of His faithfulness, of what He's done before. And because He did that then, He'll do it again. Maybe it's revisiting a journal entry where you remember a unique time and place and date, and you remember how the Lord carried you through a difficult circumstances when you thought you were at the end of your rope, where you couldn't go anymore, that if God didn't intervene, then you were done. And God did intervene, and God sustained you and carried you through that and delivered you. You and I need those fresh reminders day in and day out. Why? Because we're tempted to fear like David. We're tempted to forget how God has done marvelous things in our life. We get caught up in the grind and the day-to-day stuff of our life, and it's like it's so easy to fall back in those same ruts of despair and anxiety and worry and stress and wondering how things are going to come out. We need those reminders, just like David. Unfortunately, if David did remember, it appears he soon forgot, as we're going to read about in the next events. Let's pick up. God's grace preserves the fearful, picking up in verse 10. And David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, is not this David the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. And David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands and made marks on the doors of the gate and let his spittle run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, behold, you see this man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen, that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? shall this fellow come into my house. The story of David here takes another disturbing turn. A lot of strange things happening in poor David's life here. He had become so desperate, and Saul's pressure so intense, that David fled to Gath. Do you remember where Gath is and what Gath represents? Gath, if you don't recall, is Goliath's hometown. Remember, he's called Goliath of Gath. Deep in the heart of Philistine territory. The Philistines, who are the sworn enemies of Israel. Think about how David must have felt in this moment where he thought it would be that the very last place that Saul would find him and look for him would be there. I don't know why he went there. Maybe he thought he could blend in somehow. Right? Just kind of blend in with the crowd. I just kind of lay low for a while and maybe things are going to blow over. Maybe he thought, here, just Saul's great commander would defect, right, and just would be a great victory for the Philistine. I don't know what was going through his mind in this particular moment right here. But how difficult would it be for the man who killed the Philistine champion to show up with the champion's own sword and think that he could hide out in Gath? Right? That's not really being incognito. And if you recall, what was David doing in just the most recent times? What was Saul sending him off to do? Fight the Philistines. Fight the Philistines. He'd been fighting and inflicting serious damage on the Philistines. But here David evidently feared Saul more than he feared the sworn enemies of Saul. And if going to enemy territory was his best hope, then he was in some real trouble. Now, I don't know how long he was there incognito, but it didn't last long. It didn't take long for the servants of Achish, the king, to recognize him and report it to the king. And so what do they say? Hey, isn't that David? Like all the people are out there singing about him and they're doing these TikTok dances to this little song about David. Saul has struck down his thousands, but David has struck down his 10,000s. And it's all the rave, right? That's the playlist of Israel here. They knew about the song. And they knew that that many of the slain 10,000s were their own people, the Philistines. And here their mortal enemy is in their midst, hiding out. And notice they refer to David as the king of the land. That's interesting, isn't it? Who was calling David king? Nobody. But here they have the impression that somehow David was either already the king or was going to be made king because of his great military success, because of how he had inflicted such harm on the Philistines, right? So they're calling him the king, the ruler of the land, and he would become that someday. They didn't know this, but they were right in that. So David was no folk hero here in Gath. He was just public enemy number one. David's in a dangerous place. But look what verse 12 says, because it reveals to us his conflicted emotional state. David took these words to heart, and he was much afraid. Took him to heart, he was much afraid. He's in immediate danger, and he realizes it. Any hope of safety in Gath is gone. He's gone. He's seized. He's taken into their hands. That means he's taken into custody, right? They grab him. And then what he does is something just desperate and frankly just crazy and undignified. I don't know how many of us would have thought to do what David did in that moment. But David puts on a great performance here. He chooses to act like a madman. Like he has just lost his mind completely. He begins to scratch and claw at the doorposts, and he's just drooling, and the spittle is just kind of running down his beard. I don't know if you've ever seen someone who's actually lost their mind and in that kind of state. I grew up in New York City. I saw that in the subway all the time. You see individuals who've lost their mind. You see that, sadly, we see that in our own communities here, people who are in that state genuinely, right? Acting in a crazed mental state. And David is in such despair at this moment that he's thinking, I got to get out of this situation. I'm in serious danger here. I'm just going to act like I've lost it. There's no way the king's going to want to keep me around, right, if he thinks I've just lost my marbles. And that's what he does here. Now, in the ancient Near East, people held a superstitious fear of people in a mentally disturbed state. They didn't really know what it was, but they attributed it to maybe a curse or spiritual forces, right? So they don't want this individual around. And so David's plan worked. Achish says, this man is nuts. Why did you bring him here? I've got enough crazy in my own house. I don't need another one, right? And David's able to get away. Achish is so revulsed by the sight of David slobbering hysterically that he wants him gone. David's running from another wicked king. He's on the run. But how are we to understand this strange scene? Because it's a low point in David's life. This was not one of his finest or even most faithful moments, but one of his most frightened moments, for sure. He's just trying to save his own life, the only way he could think of. And he did it by hiding who he really was, or pretending to be something else, which is exactly what a lot of people do. A skill that many employ. They learn how to survive by pretending, by putting on the mask of self-reliance, self-sufficiency, self-preservation, to change their behavior, so to speak, as David did, so that people will not see how fearful they really are or how they really don't have it all together. Come on, we know that. Some have perfected the look of a person who has it all together, where everything's fine. So they'll show up to service on a Sunday, and nobody has any idea that on the inside, things are just falling apart. Fear makes us hide. Fear makes us pretend. What David does here in this story is no different than what many of us do in similar situations. Again, David was a real man, a believer who sometimes acted with incredible faith, and at other times he acted out of sheer panic and frailty. And his actions here at Gath were far from heroic or exemplary. Yet, God was faithful. God was faithful to the covenant promise he made to David. God had anointed him. God had anointed David to be king, and God would preserve his life, even when David was acting like a madman in enemy territory and in fear of his life. How's that for the grace of God? How's that for the unmerited kindness and mercy of God? Did David learn any lessons from his time at Gath? He did. He did. And we know that because he would look back at this exact experience and write a nice couple of songs for us. Psalm 34, Psalm 56. And I want you to turn to Psalm 34 with me. And I just want to look at a few of the things that David writes. If you notice in the title of Psalm 34, it says, of David when he changed his behavior before Abimelech. Abimelech's another name for Achish, the king of Gath. So that he drove him out and he went away. Look down with me at verse 4. David writes, I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all my fears. Notice that he's admitting his fear. He was genuinely in fear of his life. But David did not take credit for his escape. He doesn't credit his superb acting ability, right before Achish, pretending to be a madman. He does not attribute his escape to just some dumb luck. As some people say, I was lucky to get out of that situation. David credits the Lord who heard his cry and delivered him. And then this deliverance, right? This acknowledgement here is not just for him. This is also instructive for God's people. Because he writes in verse 11, "Come, O children, listen to me. I will teach you," notice what he says, "the fear of the Lord." Now, was David operating out of the fear of the Lord? I don't think so. More like the fear of man. We know that pretty well. David knew that really well there. But he learned something from this situation where he says, look, I can teach you the fear of the Lord now. I can teach you that. He's using his failure to teach others what the fear of the Lord looks like. Verse 12, what man is there who desires life and loves many days? Well, that's what he was desiring in that moment, to keep his life, to preserve his life, to escape with his life intact. But here's how you can know the fear of the Lord. Here's how that looks in the life of the righteous. Verse 13. What are you to do? You're to keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Which is exactly what he did. He used his tongue for deceit, to lie. But he says, no, that's not the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord, well, that's the one who uses their lips to speak truth. And in doing so has life. He recognized the foolishness of his actions and repented. And now he's teaching others the fear of the Lord. See, God delivered him in spite of his weakness. Despite his fearful, faltering faith. Again, this is the grace of the Lord. And then in Psalm 56, where again he's reflecting of his time in Gath when he was seized. Verses 3 and 4 of Psalm 56, he writes, "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me?" Look what he's writing there. When I am afraid. He's acknowledging it. You and I should acknowledge that. We are afraid. Like we like to act like we are just like supermen and superwomen of faith. When we're not, we are pretty fearful people. And it usually doesn't take us a lot to get us to that state. But he says, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God I trust, I shall not be afraid. Look what he writes there. What can flesh do to me? Well, he was pretty afraid of flesh in those instances, right? He's certainly afraid of what Saul could do to him. He was certainly afraid of what King Achish would do to him, right? But no, he says, he recognizes now, what can flesh do to me? If God's holding me, if He's my refuge, if He's delivering me, it doesn't matter what flesh can do. Nothing. It's nothing. And then he closes that psalm with the following acknowledgement of the Lord's salvation. Verse 13 of Psalm 56. "For you have delivered my soul from death, yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life." That's what God did for him. That's what God did for him. So what was really going on behind the drooling and the clawing and scratching at the doors? Well, underneath the facade of the madman was a man who was crying out to the Lord. I don't know what that looked like. I don't know if it was just in his mind. I don't know if he was uttering words, but he was actually crying out to the Lord in those moments. And his faith and his fear were just somehow all just kind of tangled together in that. Trembling and trust just all jumbled up there. And God heard him. God heard him. He was praying, crying out. And that is the mercy of God toward weak believers like you and me. He hears the prayers that come up out of the mess of our lives. And He doesn't wait for us to just compose ourselves and get our act together. He hears us in the midst of all that. And He delivers us. He delivers us. He heard this poor man's cry with drool dripping off of his beard, acting the fool, and saved him out of all his troubles. On the other side of the sweet victory the Lord gave him, David writes a line that is a promise you and I should always hold in our heart. Psalm 34:8. Oh, taste and see. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. What a beautiful, beautiful promise. In the midst of the fiery trial, the fearful moment, the faltering faith, David learned that the Lord is good. At Nob, in his weakness, he was able to taste and see that the Lord is good. At Gath, acting in his crazed state, he was able to taste and see that the Lord is good. The Lord is good, brothers and sisters. The Lord is good. Taste and see it for yourself. Well, to just kind of close out here, we have these two events in David's life, but they speak to our lives today. First thing I want you to remember is that this passage reminds us that God's grace is bigger than our fragile faith. Our God is not limited to the size of our faith. Our God is not limited by whatever feeble trust we claim to put on Him. He's bigger than that. His grace is bigger than that. We've all had moments when we've let fear get the upper hand. Moments where we've encountered maybe unexpected loss or suffering, financial distress, or even deep personal heartbreak. And it's those moments where many times our first instinct is to panic, it's to scheme, it's to try to control the outcome ourselves. But if your hope rests on the strength of your own faith, you're going to be let down. You will be disappointed time and time again. But I'll be honest with you, my faith isn't always that strong. And if that's what I'm trusting in those moments, I'm going to be in trouble. But if your hope rests on the faithfulness of God, you can stand firm. God did not abandon David at Nob. He certainly didn't abandon him at Gath in those moments where we could see David's faith just waning, weakened. God was there with him, and God is there with us, even in the times where our faith sometimes is just hanging on by a thread. Secondly, this passage points us directly to Jesus Christ. Man, we've seen this time and time again in the story here of David in 1 Samuel. This is pointing us to our true and greater priest and king. What we see in David in these moments was a flawed king, right? Who lied, who schemed, who fled to enemy territory for refuge instead of to the Lord, who faked madness to save his own hide. So consider the contrast with our Lord. When he was hunted by his enemies, Jesus never spoke a word of deceit. He didn't lie. When he stood before Pilate and the high priest, he didn't pretend to be something else. He didn't act like he was out of his mind to maybe escape what was coming. We have David who asked for bread, and he ate the holy bread to preserve his own life. But what did Jesus do? Jesus gave his own body to be broken like bread so that we could have eternal life. David sought a weapon to defend himself. But our Lord marched to the cross without a sword. And there he disarmed principalities and powers, spiritual forces of darkness through his death and resurrection. Remember, these things point us to our greater and more glorious priest and king. Third, this passage offers comfort for us in every season and stage of life. You know, when we're younger, especially, we face seasons where the path ahead looks uncertain. It's in those moments, maybe some of you here who are younger in life, and you face that uncertainty that life will surely bring. Those are the moments where we're tempted to compromise, tempted to compromise our integrity, to cut corners, to achieve the outcome that we are desiring or want in life, just try to secure our future. But I want you to remember David's story. I want you to remember what God did here. That God is capable of providing for you without you needing to resort, like David did in these moments, to sinful self-reliance and self-preservation. That we can trust Him with our future. We don't want to be like David in these moments, yet that's kind of our default mode. You might be carrying heavy burdens of responsibility today. You may feel exhausted by the daily demands of life, of work, of taking care of your family, of all the things that you have to do. And you feel like David did at Nob, hungry, weary, and sapped of strength. But I want you to remember that Christ calls you to His table to feed you. And He offers rest for your souls. Jesus says to us, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and you will find rest." We can rest in Him. You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. And I know some of you do. I see it on you. I hear it from you. I hear it in the things you say. You don't have to carry those things. He carries them for you. When fear knocks at your door, may you never rely on your own cleverness or resort to deception. May you never run to enemy places for refuge. Remember that when fear seeks to drive you down into the valley of desperation, God's covenant mercy drives you up to our ultimate refuge, our Lord, our greater priest and king. He is the bread of life, and He is more than enough. I pray that we would leave here today with renewed confidence. Our King reigns. Our priest intercedes for us. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good.